the recording, please? Great, thank you so much. All right, welcome everyone to this ArchivesSpace Basics training. My name is Rachel Searcy, and I am the Accessioning Archivist at New York University. I'm joined here by my fellow trainer, Corey. Corey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. My name is Corey Schmidt. I am the Project Management Librarian / Archivist at the University of Georgia Libraries. And yeah, I've been using ArchivesSpace since 2019, late 2019. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So in advance of this training, you received an email with an agenda for the training and links to all the materials you will need to participate in this workshop and to continue learning after the training is over. If you're not able to access that email, you'll find at the end of your agenda some frequently used resources. And directly within that link, you'll also find the quick guide and another copy of your agenda. We might not stick exactly to the agenda, but we will take the planned break. We are using Zoom webinar for this training, and your microphone and camera are both muted. If you'd like to ask questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have a general question or need some other form of assistance, please feel free to reach out in the chat. Some questions will be read at the end in the allocated Q&A time, and some questions we may just answer directly by typing our answers into that Q&A section. So be sure to refer to that because there might be some information there that you would want to know. We are using the latest version of ArchivesSpace for this training, which is version 3.4.0. If you're using an earlier version of ArchivesSpace at your own institution, just please keep in mind that some of the features you see today may not be available to you at home. We won't be able to troubleshoot issues with your own implementation of ArchivesSpace at your organization. But if you are having troubles with your implementation, please feel free to email us at archivespacehome@lyrasis.org. And finally, please keep in mind that there are many participants in this workshop from a variety of institutions with varied experience levels. Remember that the ArchivesSpace Code of Conduct applies to all ArchivesSpace events, including this one. So please remember to be considerate and respectful in your interactions with your fellow participants, Corey and myself, in the Q&A and the chat. So today, this training is going to provide a basic overview of the ArchivesSpace application, primarily focusing on the staff user interface. After that, we're going to explore the three primary types of records that you can create in ArchivesSpace. So those are accession records, resource records, and digital object records. Those are known collectively as material description records. We're really looking forward to talking with you today about the ArchivesSpace application. So before I dive into the content proper, I want to mention that all of the examples we're using today are real collections held by ArchivesSpace member organizations. These organizations have made their metadata available to the program for the purposes of education and training, and in the interest of creating a more diverse set of example data. We're very grateful for that. And before I get into the training proper, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit more fully. Like I said before, my name is Rachel Searcy, and I've been involved with ArchivesSpace for about 8 years now. At NYU, I worked on our migration to ArchivesSpace from Archivist Toolkit, and I act as our primary administrator. I've also been part of the ArchivesSpace Advisory Council for the past few years, and I am currently the chair of the Technical Advisory Council. I've been working in academic archives for the past 12 years, so many of my references and examples are going to be informed by that perspective. If I say something that doesn't match your process, please feel free to ask for clarity. We all know that there are many different processes, workflows, and use cases in archives, and that's true for using ArchivesSpace as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move directly into the training. So I'm just going to share my screen to start that. Okay, let's get started. So like I said before, this training is primarily going to cover working within the ArchivesSpace staff user interface. We will briefly show you what the public user interface looks like, but primarily we're going to be sticking with the staff user interface. You may occasionally hear us say things like the staff side or even the SEI. Both of those shorthands refer to the staff user interface. Similarly, if you hear to us refer to the PUI, then we are talking about the public user interface, which is the public side where researchers or patrons can go to access the material if you decide to use the public user interface at all. It is optional. So first, I'm going to give a functional overview of the ArchivesSpace staff user interface, which is what you are seeing right now. This is the landing page that you see when you log in. And at first glance, it doesn't look like it has a lot going on, but there's actually quite a bit that you can do from this landing page. I'm going to point out 4 different command zones on this landing page where you can act things in the application. So the first section, if you go to this upper right-hand corner, this is the repository and application management section. This is where you can do things that will impact your entire ArchivesSpace implementation. Some of you might be at an organization that uses multiple repositories within your ArchivesSpace implementation. So for example, you might be at an academic institution and you might have multiple special collections bodies on campus, and each will have its own repositories to manage their collections. So you might want to do that so you can share one sort of instance while still kind of having separate buckets for those different areas. If you are a user in one repository, your permissions might be set so that you only have access to that one repository that you work with. And that means that when you log into ArchivesSpace, you're going to land directly in the repository that you work in. So you wouldn't need to worry about moving between repositories. However, if you are someone who maybe has to work across multiple repositories, or you're an administrator at your institution, you will have the ability here to move between repositories. And to do that, you go to Select Repository. So in this demonstration instance, we can see that there are 2 different repositories. And if I want to move from one to the other, I simply select the one that I'm interested in and say Select Repository. I'm actually already in the repository that I want to be in, so I'm not going to do that now. Also in the upper right-hand corner of the application management section is where you can manage settings that impact your entire system. So that's where it says system and has a little downward arrow. You can manage things like your controlled value lists. So those are drop-down lists. You can manage container and location profiles, although we're not going to have time to get into that during this training, but know that that's something that you can do. You can also manage your repository. So maybe your repository's phone number or address changed and you want to update that information, you can do that here. You can manage your OAI PMH settings, and you can also manage user accounts. So if you need to manage someone's permissions or reset their password, you can do that there. You can also access system information. In general, and this will apply throughout the training today, what you see and what is available to you in these menus will be dependent on your permission levels within ArchivesSpace. So if you don't see something or see one of these options, that is why. If you are affiliated with an ArchivesSpace member organization, you have access to the Help Center as part of your member benefits. The Help Center contains the user manual as well as ArchivesSpace user tutorials and recordings of trainings. So this is a really great place for resources and a place to learn more about the application. So you can get there easily through this system dropdown, but you can also access the Help Center all throughout the application, anywhere you see one of these little question marks. So I'm hovering over one of them right now. These are context-sensitive help links. So anytime you see a question mark, that means that there's a page in the user manual that relates to that specific part of the application. So if you're looking at something and you're not quite sure what it is or how to work with it, and you see a question mark, you can click on that and it will take you directly to that relevant part of the Help Center. You do need to have an account with the Help Center, and there are instructions online about how to set that up. So just make sure that you're logged in, and then you'll be able to access it. In our next section, in this little button that has your username, here are some options for user and preference management. If you're an administrator, you can set global and repository preferences. Global preferences are those that apply across your ArchivesSpace implementation. Repository preferences impact just that one repository only. And then your default repository preferences are your personal repository preferences. So those would be any sort of settings or preferences that are more about kind of like how you like to do things or how you like to set your stuff up. Excuse me. You also have the ability, if you're an administrator, to what's called become a user. So this is really handy if you're, excuse me, I'm sorry. If you're troubleshooting an issue with another user and you'd really like to confirm what they're seeing from their perspective. You can also manage your user account from here as well as log out. Excuse me, I just need to cough for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Next, we have our gear icon. So from here, you can manage groups, meaning permission groups. You can add and create, you can create groups and add people to the different permission groups, depending on what you want them to be able to do or not do in the system. So for example, you might have archivists as well as student workers, and you might want to limit certain groups' ability to do things like delete records, or maybe even only be able to create certain kinds of records. Maybe you don't want everyone to be able to create locations, for example. So you can do that there, and you can be pretty specific and granular about what you want people to be able to do or not do. You can also manage user access, so specific users and their permissions, their passwords, that sort of thing. You can manage assessment attributes. We're not going to have time to get into assessments today, but know that you can create assessments and you can manage how they work. You can also manage your top containers. Those are boxes or basically anything that you put materials in. Again, we're not going to have time to get into container management today, but we just want you to be aware of it. You can also transfer the contents of an entire repository. Hopefully that's something you won't have to do, but if you do, hopefully you only have to do it once, and this is the place that you would do it. From the gear icon, you can also invoke background jobs. So this is one of the places where you can do things like export a PDF or import data, amongst other things. This menu is also where you can find and download bulk import templates. So those are ways to get a lot of data into the system very efficiently. If you've ever been to an ArchivesSpace training before, this might be relatively new. So I'm just going to click here. By clicking here, you will be sent to a menu where you can download the templates to import different kinds of data. And this is really great because these are the templates that are compatible with the version of ArchivesSpace that you're using. So you don't have to go to an external source. You don't have to confirm that it's the right template for your version. So it's really helpful. Also from the gear icon, you can run the out of the box reports that come with ArchivesSpace, but you can also create and run custom reports if none of those prefab reports work for your use case. This is also where you can invoke plugins. You can invoke any plugins that you've applied to your implementation. So out of the box, there's only one plugin that comes with ArchivesSpace, which is the LCNAF tool. And this allows you to import subjects and agent records directly into your ArchivesSpace implementation. So I'm actually going to go home, and you can always go back to that home screen by selecting this home icon. So the next section of the staff user interface home screen relates to a really important part of the application, which is creating and finding your records. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see the create and browse menus. So create means you want to create a new record. So we're just going to open that up for a second. Actually, I'm going to make it slightly bigger. These are the various record types that you can create, although again, what you see in front of you is going to depend on your user permissions. As you're looking at the create dropdown, you're probably noticing, or hopefully noticing, there's a little line here under these top 3 record types. So those 3 record types above the line, accession, resource, and digital objects, those are the ones that we're going to be talking about the most today. Like I said before, these are called material description records. They're records that describe your collections. So accession records describe a grouping of materials that come into your custody. Resource records typically describe collections as a unit and can be used to build a hierarchy. These are also the records that you typically transform into an access tool, like a finding aid or a MARC record. And digital object records are for managing your digital object metadata and linking out to wherever you store those digital objects. And all 3 of those record types can be linked to one another. Under the line are other record types that are intended to enhance your material description records or help you manage them in some other way. So under the line, we have subjects and agents. Subjects are topical, geographic, or chronological headings that can link your collections together. Agents are people, families, or corporate bodies that relate to the materials in some way. So these might be the creator of the collection, they could be the donor, or the collection might just be about them. You can also create container profiles. We're not going to have time to get into container management, but that is another record that you can create. You can create locations. So, and you actually have 2 options. You can either create a single location, so just one shelf, or you could create a lot of locations in sort of one go. So if you have, 20 aisles and you kind of already know what you want to call them, you could kind of create them in a batch. You can use the location and container management functionality together to use something called a space calculator to help you see what space is available for you. Pretty much everyone is tight on space. That seems to be a universal experience amongst archivists. You can create event records, which will record actions that you take on collection materials. So you might want to do this when a collection is processed or digitized or receives conservation treatment. You might also want to use it to record actions in the acquisition process, for example, like sending an acknowledgement letter to a donor or noting when an agreement is signed. There are a lot of options, and it's really up to you if and how you might want to use these. You can also create classification records. This is a really great way to group materials together that maybe don't lend themselves to shared subject headings. So a good example of this might be if you're a college archivist and you want to group together all the records that relate to the office of the president across different administrations. And then you might want another for the office of the provost. There are some really creative ways that folks have been making use of the classifications module. And there was a recent webinar on that as well. So if you're interested in classifications, be sure to check out some of the resources on the ArchivesSpace YouTube channel. Finally, let me bring that menu back up. As I mentioned before, you can create assessments of your material. This can be really helpful in determining conservation needs. We don't have time to get into this topic today, but we have done trainings on assessments in the past, which also you can check on YouTube for those. And we actually do have another training coming up in October on accessions and assessments. I think that is happening October 11th. So if that's something you're interested in, you could sign up for that. And finally, just like in the gear icon, you can also invoke background jobs from the create menu. So if you want to create one of those, like creating a report or generating a PDF, you can do that here. In ArchivesSpace, there's often more than one way to do something. And so we kind of want to just make you aware of what you can do and how you can do it. And then it's sort of up to you how, if and when, how you want to use those. So once you have created records, you need a way to find them. So to do that, you can either browse or search. We're going to start with the browse menu, which looks very similar to the create menu. And something you want to know is that you must browse by material type. So by those different record types. So let's go to browse resources. And this is going to pull up all of the resource records in my active repository. Keep in mind that when you're browsing and searching on the staff interface side, you are only going to receive results from your active repository, regardless of the permissions that you have. In the public user interface, which we'll jump to in a little bit, you can browse across repositories, but we're not there yet. So shared record types like subjects and agent records, by which I mean these records are shared across repositories in an instance, those will show up in all of the repositories. So here we have our all of our resource records because we're browsing, and on the left-hand side, you can see a number of options to further narrow your results. I'm going to skip this show components for now, but I will come back to it. So first you can filter by text. So if you have a specific text string in mind, that will help you get closer to what you need. So you can put that in the filter box. So I'm actually going to type in crispy, which will bring me to my desired record. You can always get rid of any filter or facets that you are using by just selecting this clear all button. So as you can see on the left, you can also filter by subject heading, which could be helpful if you're maybe preparing for a class or an exhibition. I'm just going to scroll down so that you can see the other options available to you. You can also check and filter on whether a record is published. And when we say published, we mean that the record is set to be viewable in the PUI. There are some other options for filtering. And this demonstration repository doesn't have a lot of records in it. I think, yeah, it says there's only 12 resource records in it. But I imagine that your own instance has quite a bit more in it. So these filter and facet options can be really helpful in drilling down and finding the specific records that you want. But keep in mind, when you're browsing, you're only looking at one record type. So I'm looking at resource records here. So regardless of the filtering and faceting that I'm doing, I will not see accession records, digital object records, or anything like that. Back to what I skipped over, which is this show components option at the top. So I'm going to select this, and hopefully this won't take too long. This is the reason I skipped it in the first place, is because it does sometimes take a bit. So as you can see here, we went from 12 search results to almost 5,000 search results. And by selecting show components, you're not just seeing the resource record or that top level record, you're also going to see all of the lower level component records or child records that are kind of one level under those, or more than one level under. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as a default method for browsing, but it is good to know that it is available to you. I'm going to deselect this because I want fewer things here. I just want my resource records. Another thing I'd like to point out is that you can also sort these results. You have a bunch of options, but that you can do that by going right here, kind of where it says the number of your search results. You have this little section that says sort by. Something that I like to do a lot is sort my accession records and my resource records to determine those that were most recently created or recently modified. So to do that, I go sort by created, descending. And I find that to be very useful in my day-to-day work. But you could also sort by identifiers, you could sort by titles, which can come in handy. If you want results across different record types, then you'll want to search. The search is a really basic Google style search. It's a keyword search. So I am going to search for that same word that I used in the facet or in the text filter. So I'm going to use the word crispy, and you just use this search box up here. And we'll see what we get. So back when we were browsing records, we browsed for all resource records. We had 12 results. And when I used the text filter for the word crispy, I received 1 search result because I was only looking at resource records. But now you can see that I have 68 search results in my keyword search for that same word. Again, we have facet options on the left-hand side to further refine what we see. So you can see that you can further refine by the record type. We have a lot of top containers, but we also have an accession record. There is an assessment record, so that can be really useful. And then we can see that we also have options to further refine by agent or subject headings. You can also do a more complex search. I'm going to just scroll back up. To do a more advanced search, you go back up to the top near this magnifying glass and go to the downward arrow. And that is going to open up a lot of options for you to specify the field that you want to be searching for. So maybe instead of keyword, you want to search for an identifier. And you can also combine different search parameters together. So you do that by just selecting this green arrow, and it will bring up another set of fields to you. And you can string these together with your Boolean operators and or not. You can also search within particular date ranges. If you've realized that as you're building your complex search, you don't want to do it or you don't like what you see, you can always get rid of it with this red trash icon here, just like that. So with that, I'm going to move over briefly to show you what the public user interface looks like. To access the public user interface, you can go back to your home screen, which is, sorry, I already did that. I was moving a little fast. Go back to your home screen, and at the bottom on the right-hand side, you'll see this says View Public Interface in the lower right-hand corner, and that will move you over there. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so what we're looking at now is a very basic out-of-the-box ArchivesSpace public user interface. To be clear, using the public user interface is entirely optional. There are different ways that people make their materials discoverable to users outside of this. So you could choose to export metadata into other systems and use a different front end. But this is available to you. It's an option. Most of what you see here is customizable. You would likely want to replace the ArchivesSpace logo with your own and change the colors so that they match your organization colors. So you can do stuff like that. And you can also change the types of records that are available for browsing. So up here, this little menu bar that I'm kind of hovering over, here are the out-of-the-box record types that a user can browse. They can browse by repository. So within this ArchivesSpace implementation, we have 2 different repositories. A user could potentially select just one of those and see only the records inside of that. They can also browse all of the collections that are available. So on the staff user interface side, those are called resource records, and in the public user interface, they're called collections. But that is also customizable. If you wanted to call them something else, you could. If you wanted to call them fonts or whatever, you could change that. Users can browse digital materials that are available and also browse unprocessed materials. So those come from accession records. Some organizations choose not to publish their accession records for a number of reasons, and that is definitely a valid decision. And if that is what you want to do locally, you could also take this record type away from this menu bar entirely. You can also browse by names, which are agents, as well as subjects. And record groups up here, those are the classifications I mentioned earlier. So it's possible for a user to browse many different record types, but not all of them. Like they won't be able to browse locations, for example, in the public side, and you can probably understand why. Users can also search, and this operates very similar to how it does on the staff side that we just saw. You can do a basic keyword search, or you can build more complex search. Anytime you see this little magnifying glass, you can always click there, and it'll open up it'll bring you back to a new search. So very briefly, I'm going to show you what a collection looks like from the public user interface. And actually, we're going to first search to find it. And I'm searching because I have a particular one in mind that I'm thinking of. So I want to go to this Tomi Arai and Ligan Wang papers. We're going to open up the collection. And this is what a published collection might look like to a researcher. You notice that there are a number of ways to dive into the material. On the collection overview tab, which is where I am now, you see some of the kind of most important notes. So we have our scope and content note. We also have dates, and we have information on how a user could access or use this material. We also have some biographical notes. And then we keep scrolling, and then under here we get an accordion with kind of more descriptive information, but maybe not the most critical ones for a user to understand, although I believe that is also, I hope, customizable to determine what goes in the accordion and what does not. But this is something that you can collapse or expand as you would like. Underneath, this is also where you have your linked agents or names and subjects, as well as some more kind of administrative information about the finding aid itself and the repository that it lives. Just going to scroll back up to the top. And then over on the right, you can see more of like the finding aid data, the hierarchy, and the inventory. And users have the ability to sort of move around within that hierarchy. So if they're looking through this collection organization tab and see a particular item that's interesting to them, they can click on that. So I'm going to just click on this basement workshop component right here, and it moves me directly into that record. ArchivesSpace provides breadcrumbs to help researchers see sort of where they are and where they are in relation to the larger whole. So you can see that kind of right here. We are looking at the particular file for this basement workshop, and we can see that it belongs in this series on community activism, and we see that we're actually looking at this particular collection, and that this collection lives in this particular repository. So those breadcrumbs are really helpful with orienting the user or yourself about where you are. And you can also use them to kind of hop around or hop up levels. So if I wanted to go to just this series, I can do that by clicking in the breadcrumb. ArchivesSpace creates an out-of-the-box citation, or you can provide your own citations. That's this little button here. ArchivesSpace also makes it possible to request material. This is just functionality that allows your researcher to send an email to whoever you designate to receive the email. It's not a circulation system. It doesn't keep track of that sort of thing. It literally just sends an email to someone that you can then reply to. that's what this request button does. There's also a staff only button, the one with the pencil, and that will be available to you if you are logged in on the staff side. So most users are not going to see this staff only button, but this is super handy if you are looking at a record in the PUI and you notice like a typo or something that you want to quickly correct. It's going to take you back to the staff user interface directly into the record where you selected, but on the staff side. So we can see I'm in Series 1, Community Activism, and maybe there's a typo there. So I'm going to select staff only. And you can see that it brings me right back here in edit mode. So again, it's really handy if you want to make quick corrections. And just like with this public user interface, if you're working in the staff side and find yourself to be a little bit lost, there's also breadcrumbs up here. It's going to let you know whether you have the record open in view or edit mode. So I can see that it's in edit mode. And we can kind of see where we are in the hierarchy. I'm actually going to jump down one level just to make it a little bit more clear. But we can see that, you know, this component that we're in belongs in this Tommy Orion, Lee and Wong papers. And it also tells us that it is a resource record. So these are live links as well. So I could use this to jump back to that particular level. So I'm just gonna look about where we are on time. I think we're actually really good on time. Great. So now what we're going to do is look at accession records and look at creating accession records. So to do that, we're going to go to Create Accession. And this is going to open up a blank template to create an accession record. There's another way to create a new accession record, which is if you are, I'm actually just going to show you, I'm going to cancel this because I haven't created the record yet. But if I go to browse accessions and, you know, maybe I'm looking, I think there's already an accession record, so I'm browsing for it. And then I realize, oh, actually that doesn't exist. I need to create it. Up here in the menu bar, there's this button called Create Accession. So I can click that and it gets me to the same place. Accession records are used to document what you know about materials that come into your custody. So this could be for a new collection. It could be for an accretion to a collection you've had for decades. It could be a single item, like a scrapbook, for example, or it could be hundreds of boxes. It could be any of those circumstances, and you would want to create an accession record for any of them. So here's our blank accession record. It has many fields and many available subrecords. So this might seem like a lot, but please don't be overwhelmed. You don't have to put information in each of these fields. In fact, accession records require very little from a system point of view. Currently, there's no descriptive standard in the United States to guide the creation or management of accession records. But there is actually a working group developing best practices for accessioning. I'm actually on that working group. So hopefully, potentially in the near future, that is something that will exist and can help people decide what fields in a record like this they might want to use. For now, though, to save an accession record and for it to be valid in the system, all you actually need is an identifier. That is it. So I'm going to create that now. So let's see, I want to do 2023, 120. You might have noticed that as I put information into one box, the box afterwards becomes available to me. It's no longer grayed out. You don't have to use all 4 of these boxes, nor do you have to use any sort of set format or standard for your identifier. You could put all the information into the first box, and that would also be fine. ArchivesSpace does not have an opinion on that. Just make sure that you're consistent in the way that you apply it across the board and follow your own internal practices. ArchivesSpace does, however, require that accession or that identifiers for accession records be unique. So I'm going to save this record because it's all I need. If I tried to create another accession record and tried to use the same identifier, 2023-120, it would not let me do that. That number does have to be unique. So you will notice, as we're using the application, that if anything is required, you'll see a red asterisk. So the only one you see is near this identifier field. That means that the information is required to save the record. And you see that when I created and tried to save the record, because I had that information, I got a nice, happy green message saying that my accession was created. If I tried to save it without that information, I would have gotten a red error message that would have given me helpful information about what I need to do in order to save the record. Obviously, you're going to want to include more information than this to have not just a valid accession record, but one that's useful and meaningful to you. You probably want to include a title or a date, but again, that would be entirely up to you. Instead of building out an accession record in real time, what I'm going to do is open up one that already exists in the record in our database. So just one moment. And actually, I do need to change repositories now because the when I was in the PUI, I was searching across repositories. And when I went back to the staff side, it brought me back to a different repository. So, so there we go, seeing that in action. So this is the accession record. I'm going to make this slightly bigger. The accession record for the Krispy Kreme corporate records. And I'm actually going to open it up in edit mode, because then you can actually see not just all the fields that are currently filled in, but also the other ones that are available to you. You can see that we have an identifier and that they included a little bit more information. We have an accession date, excuse me, and they elected not to click this publish checkbox. So the publish checkbox refers to whether the record can be viewable in the PUI. So if you're an organization that does want to make your accession records viewable using the public user interface, you would want to check this publish checkbox in order to make that happen. And that's really true for all record types. So keep in mind that for material to show up in the PUI, you need to kind of enable that and opt into that. There are ways to set your preferences. We talked about setting preferences when we went over the command zones earlier, but you can set your preferences so that any new records that you create, that publish checkbox is sort of checked as a default. Some other basic information you might want to include in an accession record includes this content description field, so a bit of a summary, as well as maybe a condition description field. Keep in mind that as you're recording information, you can likely or potentially repurpose this information down the line in other forms. So we're just going to scroll a little bit and look at some of the other fields you might want to use. You might want to use disposition to indicate what is happening to this material. So maybe what collection it's going into, or maybe you're appraising out some of the material. Maybe there's books that you are not keeping, but you're handing over to your circulating collection, just kind of wanting to record that for transparency's sake. Inventory, you could either use this field to create an inventory, or you could use it to indicate that you have an inventory. So sometimes donors give you one with the material. And here you might want to say, like, donor supplied inventory available in the collection file. Or you could, say it's available and then use this external documents section to basically like attach and upload that inventory. There's a lot of different options here. Just gonna move back up. You probably want to indicate your provenance of who gave it to you and when. There are a lot of other options here, whether there's any access restrictions, whether there's information on intellectual property that you want to record. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is the sort of information that is available. On the left-hand side, we can see how we can navigate this record. You could definitely scroll through it. You can kind of go up and down that way. Or you could go directly to specific sections by using the left-hand navigation. So for example, if I want to go directly down to our subjects, I can click subjects here and it'll bring me right there. Let's see. I can also go right back to the top by hitting basic information. You'll notice as I'm moving throughout the application, whenever I hover over or stop on a label for a field, like here I'm hovering over content description, you get these little helpful notes. So these are included within the ArchivesSpace application. The tooltips are associated with almost all of the labels in ArchivesSpace. So you just you hover your mouse over a particular heading or label to see that rollover text. And typically the text is going to include a definition of whatever that element is, and it's going to reference the appropriate rule in DAX. DAX is the shorthand for describing archives a content standard. It's the American descriptive standard for ArchivesSpace. But if you're an organization that doesn't use DAX, these rollover tooltips are totally customizable. So if you wanted to refer to a different standard, you could absolutely do that. They will also potentially reference an export format if that makes sense. So maybe MARC or EAD, and they'll usually have examples of good practice. But again, these can be modified. So if for some reason, if you have a specific internal practice for a field, you can change these tooltips to reflect that. I think I said it like 5 times in the last minute or so. These are completely customizable, but they are very helpful in determining what a particular field is and deciding whether or not you want to use it. These basic information fields are specific to accession records, so you're not going to see these in the other record types. However, you will see the subrecords that will that are available here. You'll see these in, say, resource records and digital object records. And you can use these subrecords to further describe your accession, like indicating the date ranges that are present or how much material you have. There are several subrecord types within ArchivesSpace that once you open them, they become required or have required components to them. So we're going to scroll down to a few of these. So one of them is language. So it is not required to have a language subrecord in your accession record. But once I elect to add a language or add a language note, we can see that then something does become required. So if I want to add a language, I have to put something in the language field. That's what this red asterisk indicates. Let's say I click this, but actually I don't want to add a language at all. To get rid of this, I just select this X icon here, and I actually have to do it again and select confirm removal to truly get rid of it. We can see that someone already used the date subrecord. And let's see, sorry, just lost my place in my notes. When you open up a date subrecord, multiple things become required, so that we see we have a few other asterisks here. And that means that we need to provide this information to save the record. You might also see, or might also notice, that we have a gray asterisk here under the date expression. Whenever you see a gray asterisk within ArchivesSpace, that means that the field is called what we call conditionally required. And that means that in order to save the record, you need to provide information either within that field or within another field. And you can decide which one of those is most appropriate depending on your needs. So what's conditionally required here is we basically either need something in the date expression field, or we need something in the machine readable begin and end dates. We can put it in both. We can put things in both, but we definitely need at least one of those sections to have information before we save. And again, like how and if you want to do that is sort of up to you. The date expression field allows for more sort of human understandable language. So something like circa 1930s to maybe sort of qualify that you maybe don't know exactly what the date range is, but you have an idea. That's something that the expression field can offer to you. But machine readable dates are also really great because they facilitate things like searching and browsing. So it's just something to keep in mind about how you might want to use that information. We're going to scroll down here to our extent subrecord. And the first thing you might actually notice is that there are multiple extent statements. So this subrecord, like many of the subrecords, are repeatable. Again, this is not required for an accession, but it is good practice generally to, know how much of something that you have. And once again, when we open up the subrecord, we have a number of fields that are required and noted with that red asterisk. So to include an extent, you can designate whether it's the whole or a part. So that's in this portion section. And what we mean by that is whole referring to the entirety of the accession and part being, just a specific part of it. So here we're saying that the whole accession is 18 cubic feet, but maybe actually I want to change that to linear feet. I can do that here. And so this is one of those controlled value lists that I mentioned earlier, these drop-down lists. This one is actually customizable if you have the right permissions. So as you can see here, and as might be the case at your home institution, we have some repetition here. We have cubic feet up here, cubic feet down here, cubic feet down here, lowercase. And that might be something that you want to clean up by merging things together or reordering things. This definitely has the potential to get a little bit messy, especially if you are importing data from multiple sources. And that is very much the case with this demonstration instance, is that we've imported data from other institutions. But wanted to let you know that that is available to you, and maybe it can make your life a little bit easier. So let's see. We know that kind of the accession in its entirety is 18 cubic feet and is comprised of 22 boxes. But this person who created this accession record also wanted people, whether that's their colleagues or users, to know that there was kind of something more they needed to know about maybe the volume of the materials here. And so they've created two other extent statements and used the sort of the part aspect in indicating the portion to say, also there's 500 gigabytes and also there's 800 video cassettes, there's VHS cassettes. Again, you don't have to do that, but that can be something that can be really useful in thinking about maybe like future processing or planning for your work ahead, as a 10 linear foot collection with no digital materials or no audiovisual materials. Working on that is very different than, say, a 10-box collection that also has 10 terabytes of digital data. So you also have the ability to associate agent records and subject records with your accession. I do want to mention, even though we're not covering agent records today, that no matter what the relationship is to the material, a person, a family, or corporate body should always be expressed as an agent records. Even if they are what the collection is about, you still want to make them an agent records. I want to point that out because many folks have sort of mistakenly done that, put people as subject records, and have later found themselves confronted with a data cleanup project. You can also link subject records to your accession record. So if the subject record already exists in your instance, to add a new subject record, you just either click this plus button or you could select add subject, either work. If the subject record already exists in your instance, you could type a head for it. So I actually don't know entirely all the subject headings in here, but let's just say we want to add art exhibitions here. We can type a head for that. We could also browse. So to do that, I'm going to click this downward arrow and go browse. And then again, I can kind of filter, facet, do whatever I want. Let's say Krispy Kreme is also very much about socialism for some reason. I can add that there. But if a subject record that I want is not already in our instance, I can create it directly from this place too by going to the downward arrow and create. And that's going to allow me to create a new subject record and immediately link it to my accession record. I'm not going to do that just because we have a lot to get through, but know that that's available to you. Just going to remove that. And those methods apply to how you link agents as well. I'm going to save that just because I made some changes. And what I want to go to now is related resources. You can link an accession record to a resource record, but only if that resource record already exists. So this would make sense if you're working on an accretion to a collection that you already have. We'll talk in a moment about what you might want to do when accessioning a new collection that does not yet have a resource record. We can see when we look at this linked resource record that it's dark blue. And just to scroll up, you'll see that the agent records, those are also dark blue, as are our subject records. When we go to the subject section, we actually see that these are collapsed right now. So if you have more than a few, ArchivesSpace is going to kind of try and save you a little bit of performance time and not immediately load all of them. So if I want to see what those are, I'm just going to say, please click to load records. So yeah, these are all dark blue. When you see a blue record like this, it means that it is a record unto itself. And if you click on it, so let's see what donuts is about. I click on it and I want to select view. It brings me to that subject record for donuts. So we're just going to go back for a moment. So we have a resource record linked here. There's already a resource record for the Krispy Kreme Corporation records. But let's just sort of imagine, won't you, that this is a new collection and there is no resource record already. We have a lot of good information in the accession record that we would love to build out with a little bit more description, but we don't want to redo all of that work. But we're in luck because we can use this functionality called spawning, which is going to help us out. And what this does is it sort of spins off a new record that takes pieces from our original accession record so that we don't have to duplicate our work. We'll then sort of tweak what we're given in the new record, but we don't have to start from scratch. This is super useful and I use it all the time. So to do that, you go up into your accession record that you're wanting to work with, and this menu bar where it says spawn. And you actually have 3 different options. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can spawn another accession record from this. So this is super useful if you maybe have a donor who donates very kind of homogeneous materials pretty regularly. You can basically take your one accession record and say, like, make another one exactly like this, and then you can just kind of update a few different things rather than creating it whole cloth. I'm going to skip resource because that's the one I'm going to demonstrate in a moment. And then spawn archival object. This is actually new as of version 3.3.1. But what this does is basically spins off from your accession record, and it will create a component within a pre-existing resource. So that is super useful in the case of accretions, because what you can potentially do is basically take your accession record and potentially turn it into maybe like a new series in the resource record that already exists. But I am going to demonstrate how the spawning functionality works, of how you can turn an accession record into a resource record. So let's just briefly sort of review some of the information in our accession record. We have a title, we have content description, we have condition description, we have dates, we have extents, we have 3 of them, and we have a number of agents and subjects linked to this record. So we're going to go all the way back to the top, and we're going to say spawn resource. And what you can see is it's spinning up kind of what a resource record could look like with this information. As you can see up here, there's this message that says, this record is unsaved. You must click save for the record to be created. So we haven't truly created the record yet. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But we can see that we have a resource record that has ported over a lot of the information from our accession record. Corey's gonna talk about accession record or resource records in a little bit, so I don't want to go too into that content, but we can see that we have certain things that are going to be required of us, and in order to save the record, we'll need that. But just kind of scrolling through, we can see that our date subrecord came over. All of our extent statements came over. This did not come over because it does not exist in an accession record. We can see that it already has made a link between our new potential resource record and our kind of original accession record. We can see that our agents and our subjects made it over. And then we can see that some of our more free text was transformed into notes. So our content description field from the accession record was turned into a scope and contents note, and our condition description field was turned into a physical description note. So again, like, you probably want more information in your resource record, but isn't it great that you don't have to create this all over again? You can kind of port it over from your accession record and use it as a foundation to build upon. Let's see. Like I said, this record isn't created until you save it. I'm actually not going to save it because we do already have a resource record for this collection, and I don't want it to get confusing. So I'm actually going to go all the way to the bottom and hit cancel, just so that it's not there. And it's taking me back to my original accession record. But that is the process. And like I said, it's really great functionality for being efficient and sort of making the most of your work. So let's see. I think I am kind of at the end of the accession record section, and I'm just going to stop sharing for a second, but it looks like we're good on time. And it doesn't look like there was anything kind of critical in the chat to address. So I don't know, Corey, should we take our break a little bit early?
Yeah, I was gonna say we could take it early. We only had one person ask a question in the Q&A, and we appreciate you using the Q&A feature. Just asking, can you attach things like a donor letter or form? I already answered that, but Rachel, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah, since we have a little bit of extra time, yeah, it looks like you totally answered the question correctly. Yeah, you could basically sort of attach anything that you wanted to. But yeah, like Corey mentioned, like ArchivesSpace is not storing that document or that asset itself. It needs to be located somewhere else. So it's basically like a pointer. So but it definitely would be possible. So if you wanted to attach like the deed of gift or a purchase agreement to the accession record, you could absolutely do that. At NYU, I typically use that external document to link to our sort of digital collection file. But yeah, there are a lot of different local implementations. Liz also asked to clarify, I shouldn't put a person as a subject. I have been doing that wrong. They should be an agent and subjects are reserved for actual subjects. Yeah, and I hope to not have introduced confusion. And so maybe I'll just share my screen again briefly because we are ahead of time. So let's go down to this agent section. So I'm in the Krispy Kreme accession, and agent records are used to record to describe entities, so people, families, or corporate bodies. And then by linking them to either accession records or resource records, you can indicate what their relationship to the materials is. So for example, here, I have applied the Krispy Kreme Corporation agent to the accession record, and I've specified that they are the creator. So they're the creator of this collection. And we've also indicated that they're the source. But if we wanted to express that an entity is, that a collection is about a person, so I don't know, let's just say that this collection is about, I don't know, Ben Affleck, is he in here? Oh, he's not already in ArchivesSpace, unfortunately, but let's just see who might come up. You know, let's just say that Nick Cave is, for some reason, very well documented in this particular collection. We could kind of indicate that relationship by applying and linking their agent record to this exception, but specifying their role as a subject, if that makes any sense. All right, so I think let's take our break, and so I'm gonna stop sharing. Let's plan on taking the original amount of time for the break. So we'll take a 15-minute break. So let's return at, let's see, 26 minutes after the hour, or something like that. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah, it works for me. So 2:26 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. We are back up and running. Rachel, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, awesome. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for sticking around. Hope you had a good break. I'm going to start my clock here and I'm going to share my screen. Make sure it's the right screen. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. So again, my name is Corey Schmidt. I work at the University of Georgia Libraries. I've been working with ArchivesSpace since 2019, since I was hired on to manage a migration very similar to Rachel's from Archivist Toolkit to ArchivesSpace, and ever since then been involved with the community in various roles, working with the API documentation sub-team, doing some trainings, workshops, things of that nature. So so this part of the training will be covering resources, and after that, digital objects. I'm going to do my best to stay within time, but it is a lot of content to cover, so if I'm a little over time, I apologize, but thankfully, Rachel gave me a little bit of extra wiggle room, so I greatly appreciate that. Thank you so much, Rachel. And yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm already into ArchivesSpace. Before we sort of dive straight into resources, talk a little bit about what they are. Um, Resources are kind of you might say that they're the heart and soul of ArchivesSpace, because they are what describe your archival materials. They are what describe your collections. They are what are used to eventually, make finding aids or whatever you use to make your collections available to researchers. In a very high level way, resource records are sort of the intellectual and physical entities that we use to describe an item or a collection of items. And if so for us in this particular section, the first 25 minutes we'll be covering single level top information for a resource record. And I'll be going over different parts of that. So there are a few different ways for you to create a resource record. The first and probably simplest way is if you're on the ArchivesSpace home screen, you go over to the top left-hand corner in the Create dropdown. You can just click Resource, and that'll take you straight there. Rachel also showed that you can spawn a resource from an accession record. There's another way to do it. And another way to create a resource is if you're in the Browse menu, there's a button in the top right-hand corner that says Create a Resource. But for us, we're just going to stick with very simple and straightforward Create Resource up here. And we are met with a brand new resource record. So as pointed out in the and previously, the left-hand side, we have our table of contents, lots of different fields of information. We won't be covering all of them, but you can find out more information about each one of these using the tooltips or in the ArchivesSpace Help Center and User Manual. And let's go ahead and just dive straight into it. So when you're creating a resource record, in the basic information section, there are 3 requirements for you to get started within this section. The first is a title. We need a title for our collection. And thankfully, I have one on hand that I'm just going to copy and paste in. And I'm just going to use the most generic and vague John Doe papers as our title. This is a free text field, so you can enter free text. You can include things like italics and bold and stuff like that, but you do have to pay extra special care because ArchivesSpace in this particular field does not check for any errors of that kind. But we will see an example of where ArchivesSpace can do that for different fields. Next up, we have an identifier. Just like accessions, they work exactly the same. There are 4 boxes there. Each one of them opens up when you enter information into the previous one. I'm just going to say MS0001. That's going to be our standard for identifiers for this particular resource. Level of description. This is describing, what is the level of which this collection, this series, this record group is talking about. So for the vast majority of things that we have at the University of Georgia, we classify them as collections. There are some cases when we might create a top-level resource record that is a collection, and then we create another resource record that is just a series, just because some of our collections are just absolutely massive and they need to be split up like that. But for our sake and for time's sake, we're just going to say the level of description is a collection. Again, it's a drop-down list. So if you want to choose something else, you can. I will mention that if you do click the other level, which I'll do very quickly here, you click other level, a new field magically pops up that says other level. This is a free text field. You do have to enter it. It is required indicated by the red asterisk. So just do keep that in mind if you choose other level, but we're just going to keep it nice and simple and say collection. And for the basic information, those three are the only requirements. Resource type is just a standard dropdown. This is completely optional. You can say collection, papers, publications, records if you want to. Publish works exactly like accessions. If you want this resource to be viewable in the public user interface, or you want information to be displayed in any exports out of ArchivesSpace, like in EAD or Mark XML for your MARC records, you want to make sure to click that publish button. And yeah, I'm going to skip these other optional fields because there's a lot to cover. The next requirement for resources is languages. So you notice that in accessions, we had to actually click add a language in order for this information to pop up. But in resource records, they are a straight up requirement. So we do have to fill out a language of the materials that we are describing. And for us, for the vast majority of the collections that we have, they are materials that are created or written in English. If you have collections that have a mix of languages, you can add multiple languages, but just by clicking the add language at the right-hand side. If, for instance, we had a mix of English and Spanish, I could type in SPA and it would automatically fill in Spanish, semicolon Castilian. And if I wanted to, I could fill out the script for those languages. I'm just going to remove the Spanish one and just stick with English. Dates, they look almost exactly the same as accession records. So you have your label, you have different labels of dates that you can use. The default is creation in this case. But if we wanted to say, this date is an issued date, or this date is a digitized or a copyright, for instance, we could do that. I'm just going to stick with what's available here. I'm going to skip expression for now, and I'm going to choose my type of date. So we have three options: bulk, inclusive, or single. Bulk and inclusive give us a range of dates, so you might recognize that as the begin and end fields that pop up here. If I choose single, though, I only have the begin range to choose from. But in this case, I'm going to stick with inclusive dates, and I'm going to copy and paste some language that I have here into the date expression. And if I wanted to enter both, I can, and I'm just going to stay very simple, 1976, 1978. I'm not going to go, oh, that's not it. 1978. There we go. And if you want to, you can toggle the date picker and you can scroll through dates if you want to do it that way. Optional fields, certainty era calendar. We won't go over that because they're completely optional and up to your local practices on whether or not you fill out that information. Extends, they work exactly the same way as accessions do. We have our portion, number, and type. Type, usually I try to go in reverse order because it makes a little bit more sense. So if we have linear feet of 5 linear feet and that's kind of describing all of our collection size. That's how much space it takes up on the shelves. We can just enter it there. We can add extents and fill out more information if we want to with add extent or the plus sign. We're going to keep it nice and simple because we have our first kind of unique section to resources, which is finding aid data. This section has information that is unique to resource records, particularly things like EAD ID, EAD location, finding aid title, if that differs from your title or title in the basic information section, subtitle, filing title, a whole bunch of stuff. The only two other requirements that are absolutely necessary for a minimum resource record in ArchivesSpace are these two right here: language of description and script of description. These are they come from Archival standards, so we want to make sure that we fill them out. We are describing this collection in English, so I'm just going to say English, and the script of English is Latin. And voila, we got that all filled out. So there are a few other fields that are kind of they can be included if you want to. Language of description note, a series statement. Finding date status can be very useful, especially if you're kind of actively working on a collection, you're actively processing it or something like that. So you might say that, hey, we're done with the processing, so this is completed. Or you say, actually, this is still in progress, it's under revision, or it's completely unprocessed. This is just the top level information that I found time in my busy day to put into ArchivesSpace really quickly. So finding date status can be very useful. And finding a note, if you want to add a note, I've noticed that a few institutions use that particular field to credit any person or persons that contributed to the creation of the metadata for the collection. As far as basic bare bones requirements, that is all you need for a resource record is your language description, script description, your extents, dates, language, and then title, identifier, and level of description. So I'm going to click save. We're going to cross our fingers. It worked. Ah, awesome. If, for instance, I missed a particular field, let's say I couldn't be bothered to fill in the identifier field, and I try to save the resource. I'm actually going to do that here real quick. ArchivesSpace is pretty handy, and it'll give me a warning, and it'll say, hey, the identifier property is required but was missing. And I can actually click on this error message, and it'll scroll down to that field that I'm missing, and Firefox is being helpful in pre-filling that data in. Can you tell I've practiced a little bit? Yeah, I can click save, and again, and we should be good to go. So as far as basic requirements for resource records, that's really all you need are those fields. For everything else, you'll want to make sure to consult either DAX or ISADG or whatever your local best practices are for additional fields. Some additional fields that I have a little bit of time to cover. I will scroll down to here. So related accessions, so kind of like in the accession record, you have related resources, but now in resources, you have related accessions. So if I wanted to add a related accession, I could do that. And if it already exists, I could search for it. Or if I click on the drop down arrow here, I can browse. But if the accession doesn't exist, then I can't add a related accession. So you want to make sure that your accession is actually created if you want to do that. I will confirm removal here. Just like in accessions, we have agents and subjects. Adding an agent linked works. I'm pretty much exactly the same as accession records. You have a role, which are defined by 3 different types. You have a relator, and then you can search for an agent if they've already been entered into ArchivesSpace. You can also create an agent. So if you use the drop-down arrow, you can say create, and it gives you an option for person, family, corporate entity. We're going to ignore software. And you can create an agent that way. We're not going to do that because we don't have much time. So I'm going to go ahead and just click confirm removal, and subjects work almost exactly the same as accessions. So if you want more information about how agents work, how subjects work, how do I import agents or how do I import subjects into ArchivesSpace using the LCNAF plugin or LCSH, you can look at the ArchivesSpace Help Center or the user manual if you have access to that. That has a lot of great information. And also do check out the ArchivesSpace YouTube channel because we have a ton of resources and training there as well. The next section that I want to cover is notes. Notes are pretty dang handy, and some notes are actually required by DACs. So ArchivesSpace comes with 29 different notes by default, so you've got a lot to choose from. Those can include abstract, accruals, your classic biographical historical note, down here, your scope and contents note. That is one of the requirements for DAX, I believe. Someone might be able to correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. And so you've got a lot of different notes, and they can be very useful for describing your collections, and especially things like restrictions if you want to do conditions governing access or use. One note that I am going to actually demo here real quick is, let's say, for instance, you wanted to create a harmful language note, but you'll kind of notice that ArchivesSpace, in all of the 29 types, it doesn't actually have that note by default. What I can do is I'm going to click General. I'm going to add a general note that will open up some new fields of information. I'm not going to worry about persistent ID, but what I am going to do in the label field, I'm actually going to type in harmful, thank you, Firefox, harmful language note here. And since I said, hey, this is going to be the label, that means that whenever a user is looking at the PUI, or if you're exporting out of ArchivesSpace using EAD, which is something we do here at the University of Georgia, it'll include that information, and it'll say, hey, this is a harmful language note, and it won't just be like general. It'll actually say harmful language note in it. The type is general, so it's a bit repetitive there. This is a bit funky, so stay with me. We have two publish boxes here. This publish box will publish the note, but if we go down to the text subnote section, there's another publish, and this will publish the actual content of the note. So if I want to say this collection may contain harmful language, then by clicking this publish, that will actually display the note that I just wrote out. So if you are concerned about making sure that everything is published, there is a handy publish all button at the very top, and I'll point that out a little bit later. So if you're just like, I want everything published, everything viewable, I'm totally confident in everything being displayed. That can be handy, especially in these cases where it can get a little bit tricky to make sure that everything is published. There is also an option in your preferences field to say, hey, just default everything to publish unless I uncheck it, and that can also be very helpful. Real quickly, also, you'll notice that in the content box, you'll see this mixed content enabled. This is a little bit handy because if I wanted to get fancy with my notes, I can start an open caret, and it automatically gives me some elements for text. These come from I think you can do HTML tagging, and you can do EAD tagging. So for instance, we use the EAD tag xref a lot. So if I type in xref and I close that caret, it'll automatically fill out the ending portion of that tag, and I can copy and paste my URL in this particular field, and it should display just fine. So that is enabled for the fields that indicate it, but for the free text fields that don't, use it at your own risk. I definitely came across many instances where people entered tags, be it HTML tags or EAD tags in free text fields, and they were not properly formatted. And man, we had a difficult time getting those to display in our Finding a website. So for notes, that's all I'm going to cover. One other tip about notes is if I have multiple notes, so I'm just going to quickly add another note, you'll notice that there are 3 gray bars on this left-hand side. I can actually order the notes, and by shifting the order in the staff user interface, that will also change the order as it is displayed in the public user interface. So if I wanted this harmful language note to be before my scope and contents note, I could rearrange them like that. You'll also notice that there's this apply standard note order. If you have a note order that is predefined in your preferences, you can just click that button and it'll automatically sort it, and it's pretty nice and handy. So I don't have to worry about, well, is this the correct order of my notes or whatever. I'm going to click confirm removal, and we're going to be done with that little bit. Okay, so as far as other fields go, I'm actually going to skip, and I'm going to go all the way back up. So I apologize for the very fast scrolling here. And I'm going to cover some very useful features for resource records that may help you later on. I'm actually going to click save first, and hopefully it will save. Okay, awesome. Up here in the right-hand side, you'll notice a few buttons. The publish all and unpublish all button, I kind of referred to that a little bit when talking about notes. This can be handy if I want to say publish all of the information in all of the fields in which I have information in ArchivesSpace, right? Make sure everything's visible, everything's published. I can click that button, or I can say unpublish everything. And these buttons are when we start talking about multi-level resource records in a little bit. So when we start building out that hierarchy, and I'll talk about this kind of section up here where it says John Doe Papers Collection. When we start building out that hierarchy is when I can click into a specific component of this resource, also called an archival object, and say I want to unpublish this particular series, but I don't want to unpublish everything in the resource. I just want this little bit. So whatever place you are currently selected in, your publish or unpublish all will only affect that current section. And again, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense when we get into multi-level resource records. A few other buttons that are very useful are export. So if you are an institution that exports your collections in EAD, we do at the University of Georgia. This can be helpful for exporting that your resource information out of ArchivesSpace in that way. Mark XML, container labels, and PDFs. So those are a few nifty export options. For merge is a case where if you want to combine the content of one resource record into another existing resource record, for example, you want to make a complex resource from several simple resources. So, I've compiled 3 different resource records, but they're all series of one big collection, and I'm tired of, excuse me, sorry about that. I'm tired of, displaying of separating all those resources. I can merge them all into one and call it a day. Transfer, that's a case where I could just transfer this resource to a different repository. Pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go into more, but there are some useful buttons here if you want to look more into that. Suppress is an interesting button. It basically suppresses this particular record from staff view, but it still exists in ArchivesSpace. Only administrators, though, can see the resource record and unsuppress it if you want to. And delete, it just deletes the resource record, and it will delete your record entirely. So there are no take backsies. Once you delete it, it's gone forever. You can't get it back. So do be very careful with that button if you have access to delete things. All right, and as far as single level resource records go, that's actually all I'm going to cover. There are a few other fields that I'm going to cover particularly in the next section. But yeah, so looks like doing okay. I'm almost at 25 minutes or so. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll start talking about multi-level resource records. So when we're talking about multi-level resource records, what now we're talking about is we're starting to build out the hierarchy of our resource. So we've filled out all of the basic information at the top level. We've got our title, we've got our level of description, we've got some notes about the collection in general. But when we say building out multi-level resource records, all that really means is the items, the series, the sub-series, all of that hierarchy, whether it be intellectual or actual, however it is in the collection, we can now start to work on creating that hierarchy within ArchivesSpace. And basically, you can kind of think of it as a parent-child sibling relationship. So right now we are at the parent, we are at the penultimate parent, if you will. We're at the top level resource record, right? There's going to be nothing that's higher than this resource level. So everything below it is a child, and if you notice in the top left hand side of the screen, you'll see this add child button next to a few other places, and this is where we can start to actually build up our hierarchy. So I can add a child to this resource record, and that will create what ArchivesSpace calls an archival object. So this archival object is it's a new kind of record, but they're all within a resource record. So this is the child of our parent resource level record. And so we can start to fill out information here. When we create, excuse me, when we start creating our hierarchy, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that in ArchivesSpace, if you want to build series, sub-series, sub-sub-series, all the way down, you can actually go an unlimited number of levels down as far as a hierarchy goes. However, if you want to export this out of ArchivesSpace using EAD, you can only go to a maximum of 12 levels deep, 12 levels of your hierarchy. So do keep that in mind if you're creating sub, et cetera, series. You just want to keep in mind that, hey, if I'm exporting this out of EAD, then I can only go 12 nested children deep. So now that we're actually in the archival object screen, we'll go ahead and talk about what is required for an archival object. You'll notice that title is surprisingly not actually definitively required. It is conditionally required. And just like Rachel was talking about in accessions, you can either use a title, or you'll notice this, and the date section also has a gray asterisk. I can also use a date. So I don't necessarily have to use a title for my particular archival object. I could use a date instead. I can also use both if that would be, if I want to be, really thorough in creating this particular archival object. So for instance, if I wanted to say this is letters, I could say that's the title that I'll be using. Component unique identifier, this is just a unique identifier. It's completely optional. Don't need to use it, but it does need to be unique. So do keep that in mind. Your level of description, this is the only requirement, the only definitive requirement for archival objects. And that's just saying what level are you talking about, right? So it just like in resource records, it's the same list, right? We could say collection, a collection underneath a collection, but doesn't really make sense though. So I might say in this case, this is actually a series. This is a series of letters, and underneath this series consists of a bunch of other items, and I can fill that in later. I can say publish. I want to make sure to absolutely do that. I can also checkbox this restrictions apply, and this restrictions apply will only apply to this particular series. It won't apply up the chain, so it won't apply to the entire resource, but it will necessarily indicate to any other archival objects that are added as children beneath this that, hey, restrictions might be applied in that case. Looking through my notes here. Dates. I can go ahead and add a date if I want to. Let's go here. So I'm gonna leave it as creation. I'm just gonna have an expression here, September 1st, 1977, and I'm just gonna say it's a single date type. And as far as requirements go, actually that's it. I could hit save archival object right now and we could call it done. Or we could click this handy dandy +1 button. And what this +1 button does is, let's say, we're working through our collection. I've filled out my information for this particular archival object. I'm ready to create a new archival object that is a sibling. So it exists at the same level of this archival object. I could click this +1 and it will automatically save what I've already entered into this archival object, and it will open a brand new archival object that exists at the same level as the one I had previously. Also realize that by using September 1st, 1977, that is a single date and doesn't really make sense for a series, but we can remedy that later on. So now you can see up here in the top part of the screen, and in fact, I'll make it a little bigger just to draw more attention to it. This is kind of our this is our tree. Like, this is our hierarchy that we're building out. This is our resource record at the top here. This is the top level information. This is the parent, and then we have a child that you'll notice is indented and nested underneath that parent. And now we have a new archival object that this little gray, you can kind of see it's at the same indentation. So that means it's a sibling of this particular archival object. So if I wanted to enter, letter to Jane Doe, and then I would say this is an item, I could save it. I could say publish. I actually definitely want to say publish. And I'm just going to save this archival object real quick. And there we go. They exist at the same level. And, I could say, hey, this is how I want to end it. We have a series existing at the same level as an item. If, for instance, though, I was like, actually, no, I want this letter to Jane Doe to be underneath this series, I can use a handy dandy feature called Enable Reorder Mode. And I apologize for talking very fast. It's a lot of content to cover. Up here in the top left-hand part of the screen, you can see Enable Reorder Mode. I can click that, and it's going to eliminate all the fields, and it's just going to give me this tree view. And over here on the left-hand side, I'm currently selected in letter to Jane Doe, so I have that currently selected. I can click and hold these bunch of little dots here. I can drag it up, and as soon as it turns green over this one, I know that I'm hovering over this letters. I release, and then I have three options. I can either add that item before letters, so I can add it above. I can add it as a child of letters, or I could add it as an item after, but in this case, it wouldn't actually change the order. So I'm actually going to add items as children. It's going to think about it for a second, and voila, we now have a properly nested hierarchy where we have our top level parent, which is our resource. We have a series, which is a parent to the child, letter to Jane Doe. And if I wanted to add more series, I wanted to add series at the letters level, I could absolutely do that. And I could just continue building out the hierarchy from there. Another unique feature of Enable Reorder Mode is the ability to bulk delete things. The way you would do that is, let's say you have a bunch of archival objects and you're like, yeah, we don't care about these archival objects anymore. I just want to batch delete them. Well, in ArchivesSpace, the only way that you can really do that, at least efficiently, that is you go into your resource record, you go into Enable Reorder Mode, create a dummy series. So in this case, I have letters, but I would create a dummy series called Delete Me, and then I would use this Enable Reorder Mode to take all of those archival objects that I want to delete, and I put them as children underneath the Delete Me series. At which point, I then just delete the series, and that would automatically delete all of the children underneath that series, as well as the series itself. So it's kind of a unique little hack, if you will, to batch delete just a bunch of archival objects, because unfortunately there really isn't a way to do that within the staff user interface. So do keep that little trick in your back pocket. We have definitely used it a lot here at the University of Georgia. So as soon as I'm done with disable reorder mode, all I have to do is click the button that says disable reorder mode. I don't have to click close record. That would actually just close out the editing of everything. So I'm just going to click disable. And you also notice there were a few other buttons there. And again, if I had a bit more time, I could go into more depth with it. But now we go back to our original edit view of this particular archival object. And we notice now that it is a child of letters, so that's great. We'll also notice that ArchivesSpace is being helpful. It says, please be aware this record has an ancestor that is unpublished. That is interesting. Which one is unpublished, I wonder? Is it this one? No. Is it this one? Did I forget to publish it? I did. Yes, the resource is unpublished. So I just click publish here, click save, and voila, we got it. So this is the part of the training that is, if it hasn't been confusing already, it might get a little bit more confusing. So please bear with me. When we're talking about editing archival objects, one very important piece of that is what's called instances. So you may see on our table of contents, we have a bunch of stuff that we've already seen before, dates, extents, agent, subjects, notes. One of these is instances. So this is one of those that is unique to archival objects. And when we talk about instances, we're talking about, this might get a little heady here, so bear with me for a second. We're talking about embodiments of the same content in different versions and media types. So think of it like this. We just created this archival object that is called letter to Jane Doe. That is a physical thing. That is a manuscript letter. It exists. I can hold it in my hands. I can indicate in instances that this is a text. This is something that actually exists. If, for instance, we had a digitized image of that manuscript letter, I could also use instances to indicate, hey, we have a digital object that is a digitized image of this material. That is kind of what instances does. It says, what is the, this is where it makes ArchivesSpace kind of comes head to head with the metadata intellectual content and the physical items that are stored in boxes, stored in folders, or they are digitized and stored in your digital asset manager or your file server. So enough blabbering. I'm actually going to click add a container instance to show you what the heck I'm talking about. So as soon as I say add a container instance, there are two required fields that we have to keep in mind. One is, the first is type. So what is this instance type? This instance type is a letter, so we know it's a manuscript letter. So I could say it's a text. I might also say, if it's if we're describing at the folder level, we're not describing at the item level, and this folder has just a bunch of stuff. It's got photographs, it's got letters, it's got maps, it's got weird stuff in it. I could also say it's mixed materials. It's just a folder of mixed materials. I could also say it's graphic materials. We might have an artist donate their materials, and it's a bunch of drawings or art in some fashion. So for us in this particular instance, I'm just going to say it's text because I'm describing an individual item, and it is a textual type of content. Next requirement is top container. So top container, again, is one of those a little bit tricky questions, a little bit tricky, but it's basically just talking about what's your box. What is the top level container that is holding the thing? So if we have already, let's say we've already been building out our resource and we've already created a box 1, box 2, box 3 in ArchivesSpace, I could search for that box 1 right here. I could say box 1, I could type it in, and if we had magically created found a resource that had a box one, then it might show it as a result. In this case, it doesn't. So what I'll need to do is I'll use this drop down arrow here, and because there's nothing associated with this resource, I can't use browse because there will be nothing to browse, but I could say create. And this is where I could actually create a top container, and I could say, and again, this is extraordinarily brief. I highly recommend going into the Help Center or any of the YouTube videos that we have available to go further in depth with this. But if I want to say this is box, so I'm just going to say container type is a box. The indicator is 1 because it's box 1. If I have a barcode, I can enter that barcode in here, and barcodes are very handy. Highly recommend using them if you can. I can also add a location to this box if I want to get into location management, which we are not going to get into because I don't have time. I will click create and link on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And we have linked a top container. And then that's all we need for the instance. So we've indicated that this particular archival object is a instance type of text. It's a physical manuscript letter, right? We've got it in our hands. It's a text, and it is within the top container of box 1. I can go further with that and say, hey, what is the when it says child type, I could say the child type is a folder. So this is talking about the, this is a folder, and I'm going to say this is in folder 1. And if I put barcodes on my folder, I could enter that. And I could go even further and say the grandchild type is an item, and it's item number 1. So this is kind of where hopefully it starts to make a little bit more sense of when we're talking about instances. This is kind of where the physical kind of meets the metadata and the intellectual hierarchy that we're creating in ArchivesSpace. So if I wanted to save that, I could do that. You'll also notice that I could add a digital object from this screen. We won't talk about it just yet. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm actually doing well on time. Yay, this is great. So I'm going to click Save Archival Object. And we're done. And we notice that in our tree view, you'll see that text is there along with box 1, folder 1, item 1. That's all of our information of our instances displayed. If we had a digital object, it would also say, hey, there's a digital object or a thing that is available for this particular archival object. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. A few other things that I want to quickly talk about before moving on to digital objects. There are a few other buttons that can be extraordinarily helpful when you are building out your hierarchy or you're trying to create 10, 100, 1,000 archival objects in ArchivesSpace. One is this Load via Spreadsheet button. The load via spreadsheet, basically, as I think Rachel kind of pointed out, in ArchivesSpace, you can download a spreadsheet template where you can take that and it gives you basically all of the same information that you see here in the staff interface, but in spreadsheet form. So all of those fields are in columns, and you add information row by row, indicating individual archival objects, and you can build out that hierarchy within that same spreadsheet. So you fill out all your information in the spreadsheet, and then you upload it back to ArchivesSpace, and you've just imported 1,000, 10,000, maybe not 10,000. It might be a bit much for ArchivesSpace to handle. But you could do it in batches, and it can save you a whole bunch of time. And a lot of people really love this feature. I know we use this feature a lot. It is very useful, and there are guides on how to walk you through doing that. Another way to rapidly enter data in ArchivesSpace is to use the Rapid Data Entry tool. This is similar to Load via Spreadsheet, except you're still within the ArchivesSpace interface, and you're entering information row by row to add individual archival objects. However, in the Rapid Data Entry, those archival objects are at the same level, so you can't create a hierarchy. And also, generally, it's recommended that you don't add more than about 20 or so rows at a time. That's because ArchivesSpace can get finicky. And if you have 50, 100, 500 rows, and then, oh, ArchivesSpace says, hey, by the way, your session has been logged out. Sorry, you've just lost out on a whole bunch of information. So highly recommend using that at least, at maximum 20 to 30 is recommended at a time. If you find that useful. Again, we don't really have time to go over that because we're at 45 minutes exactly. And 45 minutes means that I have to move on to digital objects. So I'm afraid I can't really stop for questions at the moment because I do have to go straight into digital objects. But hopefully, if I remain on track with time, we can answer a whole bunch of other questions and go deeper into resources at the Q&A session. So I'm going to go ahead and close this record, if it will let me. Yes, it will. Awesome. And we will move on to digital objects. So digital objects are the third and final, not final, but they're the one of the other main records in ArchivesSpace. One of the main ways that you can use ArchivesSpace to describe your materials, particularly of the digital kind. So I'm going to, before I start clicking create and all that stuff, I'm just going to talk a little bit. So hopefully you can give me a little bit of a minute to describe some of the context here. Digital objects, what they are is they describe and link to digital materials, and those links can be to your digital asset manager or your file server. Do keep in mind, though, that ArchivesSpace is not a digital asset manager. It will not store your files. It will not store your JPEGs, your PNGs, your PDFs. It won't do it. It's only used for metadata description. So do keep that in mind, but you can describe your PNGs, your JPEGs, your PDFs in ArchivesSpace and link to them. And that's kind of where the usefulness of digital objects really comes from. There are two kinds of digital objects that we're going to talk about. One is a simple digital object. And when we talk about simple digital object, what we're really talking about is a one-to-one relationship. One digital object links to one digital thing. And that digital thing could be a digitized image of a picture, of a letter, could be a PDF, a 500-page PDF of a book, or a 50-page PDF of a scrapbook, for instance. But critically, the link is just one. It's pointing to one thing, right? It's pointing to one digital object that is somewhere else. So it's a nice, simple one-to-one. There's nothing complex about it. Complex digital objects, on the other hand, you can really kind of compare them to resource records. They are digital objects, but with a hierarchy. So you might have a top-level digital object, describe something like a book or a scrapbook as a whole, and then you create children underneath that digital object, and those children are called digital object components. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And those digital object components, or those children, reference different parts of that book, that scrapbook. So, right, each section might have a chapter of the book, or might be an individual page of a scrapbook. So it's basically building out a hierarchy, but just for digital objects. Do keep that in mind, because if you want to export anything out of ArchivesSpace using EAD, complex digital objects, that does not work. So if, however, you are exporting using METs, mods, or Dublin Core, you can export complex digital objects out of ArchivesSpace. So if you're doing that, absolutely go wild. But if you are exporting using EAD, stick with simple digital objects. So when we talk about digital objects here, and I start showing you just in a little bit, really what you want to do is you want to think of how you want to use or represent digital objects in ArchivesSpace, and in your use case, right? Do I want to build out a hierarchy, or do I want to keep it nice and simple, one-to-one kind of a ratio? So with that in mind, let's actually get into digital objects and start talking about it a little bit. there are two different ways for you to create a digital object. The first and most straightforward way is to go in the Create drop-down menu and say Create Digital Object. The other way is if you are in edit mode for your archival object and you're like, hey, I want to add a digital object, right? We've made this letter, we digitized it, I want to add a digital object. I can also click in my Instances field, Add Digital Object, and from there, I can then, it makes a little thing here, I can click on the drop-down arrow and I can say create, and that opens up a pop-up so I can start filling out that information. I'm not going to do that though, so I'm going to confirm removal. I'm going to save again, and I'm going to do it this way with create drop-down, create digital object. Okay, so now we're in the create digital object menu. We've got some options of fields that we can enter. For digital objects, there are two required fields, title and identifier. So for me, I'm going to enter some information here. I'm going to say huskies, sled dogs, and I probably should have learned how to pronounce that. And then I need to enter an identifier, and I will just enter an identifier. It's a free text field, but I believe it's limited to alphanumeric characters. So do keep that in mind if you are if you fancy ampersands or anything fancy, it might not work in your identifier field. Next up, publish. Absolutely, when we want to publish this, VRA core level. If you use that, it's there. Digital object type can be useful if you're particularly noting things like a text or a still image. That can be pretty useful. So I'm just going to say still image in this case. Does it have restrictions? Does this digital object have restrictions? Yes or no? You can enter that information out if you need to. And as far as basic requirements, that's actually it. But if you want to create that 1-to-1 ratio, right? I have a link to a digitized thing. Where does the link go? That is where file versions come into play. So this section here called file versions, I will click add a file version, and this is where I can finally enter that URL that we've been talking about in this particular field called file URI. And you notice that has a red asterisk, so I absolutely need to fill this out with something. And lucky for us, I do have a link. And from there, I'm going to make sure to click publish, because if you don't click publish to the file version, the link will not appear. I got burned by that a few times, so do keep that in mind. Make sure to publish your file URIs in your file versions. After that, there are a bunch of different optional fields that you can fill out if you want to. Some of those that I'll briefly go over real quick. Use statements is, what is the digital file for? Is it preservation, access? Is it a thumbnail? Right, so I could say image master, image thumbnail, that kind of thing. This actuate, show, xlink, actuate, and show, you can actually set this to generate a thumbnail that is viewable in the public user interface. I believe it's onload and embed are the two options that you use. So if you want users in the public user interface to see a thumbnail of that image, and critically, this image is an actual, it's a JPEG, a PNG, or a TIFF. I think those three are what is needed. Then a thumbnail can be properly generated within the ArchivesSpace interface, or not generated, but pulled from that image. The minute tag be pulled from the image and displayed in the ArchivesSpace public user interface. Other options that might be useful: file format, checksum. If you're particularly dealing with born digital objects, this might be very useful. Indicating the checksum method, or the free text field of what checksum you might be using. I'm going to leave that all blank. I'm going to before I move on, the one other thing I should mention is that you can add multiple file versions. So if I wanted to say, this is my image, but I wanted to add another file version with another URL, for instance, this is the actual image, but this other URL is linking to the page on which this is, you can find out more information or something like that. I can do that here, and I can say publish or not. I'll go ahead and get publish because I'm real stickler for that. I'm going to go ahead and click Save Digital Object. We're going to cross our fingers. Hope it works. And it has. Awesome. Fantastic. So now we have created our simple digital object. This is a one-for-one, meaning that it's linking to one digital object. Yes, it has multiple file URLs, but that it's still referencing one thing. I'm still referencing the same Huskies sled dogs image. If I wanted to see how this looks like in the ArchivesSpace public user interface, I can click this View Publish button, and we cross our fingers. Hey, there it is. And because we did the X-Link little trick, we have a thumbnail. And because we actually have that second URL, this image is actually clickable. So I can click, and it will take me to the second URL that I linked there. So that's a little bit of a weird distinction. You're like, wait a minute, shouldn't this first one be the one that's clickable? But in this case, if you have just one image that you're displaying, and you make that a thumbnail, that's all it's going to be in ArchivesSpace is a thumbnail. So if you want to create that clickable nick, you'll have to create a second file version and put a link there in order to make it clickable. Another thing that is very new as far as ArchivesSpace 3.4 goes is this Make Representative button. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but basically what it means is it's primarily useful for the public user interface. If you have multiple file versions, like what we do here, you can select the one that will display an image or thumbnail in the PUI. Otherwise, if, for instance, let's say I kept this X-Link stuff blank, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I haven't clicked Make Representative yet, so I'm going to click View Published again. You notice that now when we go into the public user interface, this is just a generic icon. This isn't a thumbnail anymore, and that's because I removed that X-Link stuff. If I go back and I click Make Representative to this particular URL, and this is the URL that has the actual image that I want to use as a thumbnail, I click Make Representative. It does that little thing. I click Save. I'm going to go back. I'm going to refresh, cross my fingers, and there we go. This now what it does is it says, this particular URL is representative. I'm going to display the thumbnail, if I can make it a thumbnail, in ArchivesSpace, and you're all set. So when I said TIFFs, JPEGs, and PNG, I actually meant to say GIFs. Sorry about that. So only GIFs or GIFs, PNGs and JPEGs will work. If you put a PDF in this file URI, it will not display a thumbnail, no matter how hard you try. I'm sorry, even if it's a PDF of an actual image, it won't do it as of 3.4. And you can also set thumbnails to display in the staff interface as well. So not just the public user interface, but you have to do that under the default repository preferences in the browse column section of that. So if you're interested in how to do that, there is information on the ArchivesSpace Help Center if that is available to you. So do check that out for more information on Make Representative. So as far as digital objects go, simple digital objects, let's see here. What else do I have in my notes? Right. If one digital object cannot be shared between repositories. So do keep that in mind. If you want to share different digital objects between repositories, you cannot do that. The only kind of sort of exception to that rule is whenever you're looking at digital materials in the public user interface, any and all digital materials from all of the repositories will display whenever you are browsing digital materials or searching for digital objects. So that's the only exception, but within the staff user interface, you cannot share digital objects between repositories. So do keep that in mind. All right. So as far as simple digital objects go, that's really the core of it. This is one image, right, that we're talking about in one particular digital object record. Nice and straightforward. When we talk about complex objects, again, we're going to be talking about building out a hierarchy. So we're building children underneath this parent digital object record. And again, just want to make absolutely clear that if I start building out that hierarchy, that's not going to work in any EAD exports, but it will be able to work with mods, mets, or Dublin Core. So do keep that in mind. So in order to demo this real quickly, I think I have maybe 10 minutes or so. I don't think it should take that long, but if I want to do that, I can click the Add Child here at the top left-hand side of the screen. I'm going to do that real quick. There we go. And now it opens up what's called a digital object component. So in resources, if we added a child, it created an archival object. In digital objects, if we add a child, it's called digital object component. Once you're in the system and using it a while, eventually you get kind of used to it. But it is a bit weird, these naming conventions, but it does eventually start to make sense. For digital object components, you notice that there aren't any like definitive absolute requirements. There are a bunch of conditional requirements. And in fact, there are 3 conditional requirements. There's a label, a title, and dates also has that grayed out asterisk. So you can use any one of the 3, and that's all you need for a digital object component. So an example of only using a label might be you have a 45 or you have a vinyl record and it's, it has 2 sides to it. There's side A and there's side B. Then or there's like tape 1 or tape 2. You could make a parent digital object that describes the whole of the tape or the whole of the vinyl record of the 45. But then you create a digital object component that describes this is side A, this is side B. So that's a case where we might use label. Title, pretty straightforward. Just, if it lends itself to having a title, we could say Husky 2, for instance, and that would be fine. If, for instance, it was just a date, we could do that. We could just say, this is a file structure that was created or something like that, and this is just the date range in which it was created. We could enter information there, and just for example's sake, I'll enter information into the expression. We've seen this done like 3 or 4 times now, so it's pretty straightforward how dates work, hopefully, to all of you guys and all of everybody. And yeah, so as far as everything goes, we can just click save. Notice that we have that +1 again. So if we wanted to keep adding siblings, so adding to this digital object component, we could just keep clicking that +1 and it would save the existing one, open up a new one, and we could go from there. So I'm just going to click save. I'm not going to click +1. And there we go. Digital object component has been saved. We've got all the information we need. And we see that in our tree view, in our hierarchy, we have our parent digital object, which is the Husky sled dogs. And then we have Husky 2, which is a child of that. And we have our buttons again, where we have enable reorder mode, add child, add sibling. We can also do rapid data entry. We do not have import via spreadsheet as a button here, but you can import standalone digital objects using a spreadsheet. In that, I believe Rachel, she showed a menu screen where you can download a bunch of spreadsheet templates, and one of those is uploading a bunch of digital objects, but those are standalone. I don't believe that those can be done as digital object components. So do keep that in mind. But yeah, we've now essentially created a complex digital object. It has a hierarchy, it has children, and from here, we can keep building out our hierarchy. We can build out our hierarchy an unlimited amount of times. So, you know, we're not limited by EAD standards now because we can't use complex digital objects with EAD standards. So we can build a hierarchy that is as nested as we want. And, you know, we can keep adding more and more digital object components as we need. We can also, you know, take a look at what this digital object looks like in the we can look at the parent, excuse me, I was about to misspeak. We can look at the parent digital object within the public user interface using the view published. But yeah, so when we're talking about creating complex digital objects, one other thing that I do want to mention before kind of finishing up here is when we are creating a digital object from an archival object, we can carry over some of the information that we have in our archival object into the digital object if we have, let me pull it up here, in our preferences, this handy new preference called spawn description for digital object instances from linked record. So it kind of works similarly to how Rachel was showing spawning a resource record from an accession record. Some of the fields of information carried over from one to the other. It kind of works the same way, except when we're talking about archival objects to digital objects. So I need to make sure that if I want to carry over, you know, I have I create an archival object for a manuscript letter and I have a digitized image. I don't want to have to copy and paste the same information about the that I have in the archival object to the digital object because it's the same amount of, you know, it's the same information. I can click this and then I can say, you know, add a digital object and create it, and it will carry over some of that archival object information into that digital object. So again, just kind of saving you a little bit of time. It's not going to carry over everything because not all the fields apply, but again, it's one of those small little efficiency gains that we try to build in. So, all right, just gonna go back here and click save, and that's actually all I have. I think we're doing really well on time. So, yeah.
Great job, Corey.
Thank you. Oh goodness, did I talk fast enough?
Yes. We do have a couple of questions. We do have a couple of questions. So there is one specifically about digital objects. Should we maybe do that first, or do you want to like catch your breath, Corey?
I'm gonna take a swig of water, and then we can get the digital object.
Well, maybe while you're doing that, there was another question that came through that I think I can answer pretty quickly. So Jennifer asks, is there an easy way to renumber folders once they are saved in ArchivesSpace? I'm thinking of the times we have reprocessed parts of collections and folders may have been removed, added, or reordered in a box. Jennifer, I have been there. And there is some functionality to do this. I'm going to put a link in the chat. So there is a plugin. A plugin is basically like a little bit of code that either extends certain functionality to an application or modifies functionality to make it behave a little bit different. But there is this plugin that I've linked in the chat that basically does allow you to do exactly that. What you do is you're basically like in the resource record for the collection that you want to make these changes to. You invoke this plugin and it will basically download a spreadsheet of all the components in the collection. And then what you can do is in that spreadsheet you've downloaded is you can make changes. So you could do things like you were saying, like change the box and folder numbers. You could also, let's say you have a folder list and everything's like all in lowercase and you want it to be in title case, like you could totally change that. All sorts of things. And then you'll save your spreadsheet and then upload it. And there are instructions on how to do that. Currently, this is available, like I said, as a plugin. So it is something that you need to add on to your local implementation. If you're using a hosting service, you can, I think, basically just ask them to add that on for you. If you're locally hosted, that might be a different process. I will say that the advisory councils and the ArchivesSpace program team are working on integrating this functionality into the core code. So I don't know what the timeline on that is, but the plan is for in a future release of ArchivesSpace for this to be native functionality that everyone will have access to. So right now, if you want to do that, you can download and install this plugin. But yeah, definitely stay tuned for this to become part of the application itself. Corey, do you want the digital object question?
Sure, I will take it. So yeah, the question is, can digital object records be associated with resource records? I'm going to share my screen again, and the simple and straightforward answer is absolutely not, but kind of actually yes. So in order to be less confusing, let me show you. So I've opened a resource record. This is one that is already existing in our instance of ArchivesSpace. If I wanted to associate a digital object with a top level resource record, not an individual archival object, what I could do is over on the table of contents, I'm going to go down here to instances, and then I will click on you notice over here it says add digital object. I can browse for an already existing digital object, I can search for a digital object, or I can create one, and that would be how I can associate a digital object with a resource record. So it's not quite the same as like a related accession or related resource or something like that, but essentially that's how you might be able to do it.
All right, we have another digital object-esque related question from Alicia, who wants to know, our digital archivist wanted me to ask if PB-Space is still being supported. I don't know a ton about this, but I believe PB-Space is or was a plugin, I think, developed by WGBH in Boston to add properties to digital objects to accommodate PB core. I am on the GitHub page for this plugin, and it doesn't look like it's been updated in a number of years. So, so you know, it doesn't look like it's actively being developed. As to whether it's compatible with current versions of ArchivesSpace, that's something I don't know about. That is always the kind of risk in using plugins or creating plugins, is that they do need to be maintained. And as subsequent versions of ArchivesSpace, you know, are released and grow, those plugins may need to be modified. So, you know, if that is something that you used or want to use, you could certainly potentially reach out to the plugin maintainer via GitHub. I don't know, Corey, if you happen to know anything more about this particular plugin.
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay. There was another question that Alicia had, and I think I tried to answer it live, but I think I may have misunderstood it. So let's go back to the original and we'll do the part one that's still in the open section. So let's see. The first one, so Alicia had asked if an archival object can have multiple parents. But they later clarified, I meant more to say, could you potentially have an object that could be in two different collections, for example, an LGBTQ plus collection and a Latinx American collection? Is there a way to do that?
Rachel, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think so. My best guess is you would have to create two almost identical archival objects, right? Same title, same information, but under those two different collections. I don't think resource records can share archival objects.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I'm not sure about the particular use case in mind, but this might actually be a case where instead of potentially trying to put things in multiple collections, you want to link collections or collection materials together using subject headings. But yeah, I think it can't be shared across different resources, but if that was really important to you, you would essentially have to basically recreate it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, isn't it possible for, it's not really related, so I apologize for going on a tangent. Isn't it possible to have a top container share multiple resources?
Yes, that is definitely possible. You could create like shared boxes. So for example, if, we do this a lot for, especially like oversized materials where a collection might have just sort of one larger item and we don't want that to just be the only thing in a box. So you can definitely create boxes that have more than one collection, have material from more than one collection in them. And I think if that's something you're interested in doing, I think going to the YouTube channel to look on for like tutorials or information on container management would be helpful, because I know we didn't really get too in-depth in that today. Oh, great. I'm glad, Alicia.
Yeah.
We do still have a little bit of time for questions if anyone wants to throw anything else into the Q&A section. And also, thank you everyone for actually putting them in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. It makes it so much easier to go through them that way. We appreciate it. Will we be receiving a copy and link to the recording? I believe so. Corey, do you happen to know how that works?
I can answer that. The answer is yes.
Great. Thank you. So yes, you will be receiving afterwards a link to the recording. Okay. Oh, it looks like we have another digital object question.
Yeah, I can take a swing at it. Let's see. Question is, a simple digital object can include several images, all of which are linked to a single archival object through a URI link, which would lead to a group of images. So for example, a book or a catalog includes 50 pages and is described as a single archival object in ArchivesSpace, but all pages, digital images, would need to be linked to that single archival object. That'd still be considered a simple digital object, and all images would need to be grouped under one URI that is linked to the archival object of the catalog. So the way I'm interpreting that is you've got, there are two different ways I'm thinking of your use case. One is you've scanned a book, a scrapbook, or something like that. There are 50 images of that, and you've put it all in one PDF file. At which case, the one archival object would link to the one digital object, and that one digital object would link to one URL pointing to that one PDF that happens to have 50 images associated with it. If it's the case where you have 50 individual images of all those pages, right? You could have one archival object. You could have 50 simple digital objects linking to 50 links to each page, but that probably wouldn't make a lot of sense, and probably would recommend going the complex digital object route and doing one archival object linking to one digital object, but that digital object then has a bunch of digital object components that would have links to the individual pages. If I'm understanding this scenario correctly. Is that kind of how you were thinking of it, Rachel?
I think so. I will admit that this is admittedly an area where I tend to get a little bit confused, and just as disclosure, like, we don't use the digital objects in this way at my home institution, so I don't have as much direct experience with it. But I think the way that you have described it is correct. We did recently do, I think, a webinar on the new and more enhanced digital object module. So I think that might be a good resource to check on, to do kind of either more complex or more advanced things. It would be my recommendation. Okay, any particular words of wisdom for folks going from paper records and spreadsheets up to ArchivesSpace? I'll maybe start, but I would love to hear what Corey has to say. One thing I would recommend is actually going to the ArchivesSpace YouTube channel and kind of browsing through the videos that are available there, because there definitely have been presentations from folks kind of talking about going through this process at their own institution. Whether it was going from a previous system like Archivist Toolkit, or going from, like you were saying, going from paper or spreadsheets. So I think looking there would be helpful, because maybe you might find a kind of kindred experience that you could refer to. Yeah, that would be my first recommendation. I don't know if you had anything to add, Corey.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit difficult for me to answer, because I think Rachel and I, we got started coming from Archivist Toolkit database. But yeah, YouTube is a great resource. I'm actually I'm wanting to post a bunch of links, but I haven't done it yet. So I'll just go ahead and post it in the chat. Just a whole bunch of resources. So apologies for the text wall. Some of these are available for ArchivesSpace members. So the help center, the user manual, and the posting in the ArchivesSpace user group listserv, those are all member only features. But the sandbox is free for people to use. So sandbox might be useful if you don't have your own ArchivesSpace instance set up already and you want to test out, hey, I've got a spreadsheet and I'm going to use one of those importer templates, right? I've got a bunch of archival objects. I'm going to create a dummy resource record and I'm going to import it into this ArchivesSpace sandbox. That could be a way for you to start testing some of that. And I believe the sandbox does get refreshed, so your data is not just going to permanently live on the public web forever. So the Google group is also great. It's not a member. You don't need to be a member, and I believe it's pretty actively used as well by experienced folks that might be able to help give you more tips and wisdom for going from paper and spreadsheets to ArchivesSpace. Yeah, I honestly think the spreadsheet importers are going to be your best bet. Background jobs, they can get pretty tricky. So you want to make sure that your data is compatible with ArchivesSpace, because background jobs in particular, they will throw out an error, and the first error they throw out will cancel the entire job. So if you're importing, 1,000 things, it's going to say, hey, there's an error, can't do it. I believe for some of the, I'm not sure I know the import via spreadsheet, you can validate a spreadsheet, so you don't have to find out as you're importing it whether or not it's actually going to work. You can just say, hey, validate it, and then it will say, yep, you're all good to go, or nope, here are the places you need to fix it. However, for the older import background jobs, which were created before the import via spreadsheet feature, those are the cases where it's going to be a little more difficult, because those don't have a validation feature, I believe. So you just have to be a little bit more careful. That's all the advice I have. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I would just concur with Corey about that. Like looking into those import functionalities is probably going to be really useful. And if you're starting with like physical paper, potentially if you can maybe make use of like some OCR, and maybe even transform the paper into the spreadsheets before you import. But yeah, like I would say, like we do have a more kind of focused training typically on imports. It's usually imports, exports, and reports. So that might be something to look into. But we wish you good luck in that endeavor. Okay, Liz asked, if we are an ArchivesSpace member, how do we get access to the Help Center in ArchivesSpace? I tried it and it says it is restricted. Do I contact ArchivesSpace to get a login? Yes, correct. That is what you will have to do. I just dropped a link in the chat that goes through how you will get an account to that. But basically you will be emailing ArchivesSpace home@lyrasis.org, but you can follow the instructions on this website. Okay, it looks like we have a follow-up about the digital objects.
Yeah, so I think collections include several, I'll read it a little bit, include several exhibition catalogs. We digitize all pages of each catalog, but we describe each catalog as a single archival object. Okay, so it's going to be, yeah, multiple digitized images linking to one single archival object. Yeah, in which case, I mean, that's kind of a local practice thing. I would consider, I would strongly consider using a complex digital object for that. So I'd perhaps I would make a parent digital object that describes the catalog, right? And you can make that parent digital object. You can have it that spawn. What was that? What did I say? One of those features. It's a brand new feature. The spawn descriptions for digital object instances. You can take some of that information from the archival object that you already have, right? Enable that feature, and then create a new parent digital object, taking some of that information from the archival object and using that digital object, and then you can create digital object components for each of the pages. I mean, and theoretically, another way to do it is to add a bunch of file versions to a single digital object. You could do that, yeah. But yeah, I would, yeah, Rachel just linked a webinar digital object. So I would definitely take a look at the digital object webinar to get some more ideas. But yeah, that's kind of the best idea I have at the moment.
All right. It doesn't look like we have any more active questions, although we can maybe give it another 20, 30 seconds. But yeah, like we obviously had a lot of content to get through in this amount of time. So we obviously couldn't go into terribly too much detail about them, but obviously there's more to say about these record types if you want to know more about them. All right, well, I guess we can kind of wrap it up. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. If you have any questions about ArchivesSpace or membership after this training, please feel free to reach out at the email archivespacehome@lyrasis.org. Like we mentioned earlier, you're going to be getting the link to the recording afterwards. And then you also should have already gotten your agenda as well as your quick start guide. And that's a resource that you can refer back to. Also included in that little packet is an evaluation. So we would really love if you could fill that out for us. It helps us know what was working and where we can improve. So we would love if you could fill that out. I don't know, Corey, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we close up?
I made a little mistake. I posted all of my helpful links to hosts and panelists. Probably not very helpful to everybody. Apologies for that one. So I posted the ArchivesSpace email, and let me actually post the links so that everybody can see them. There we go. Hopefully everybody has a little bit of time to grab those. But yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you everybody for coming along and asking great questions. And yeah. And the tech support also. Thank you, Sam.
Yes, thank you,
and
tech
Shania.
support. You were wonderful.